Okay, ladies and gentlemen, chapter 12, which is about psychological assessments and research in the work context. It's really unfortunate we're not doing this in class, but on the other hand, at least we've got Blackboard as a resource to use. As I'm over the different issues here, it's basically chapters divided into two halves. So one is about psychological assessment, and the second half is about research. Um, Okay, guys. From chapter one, we spoke about the fact that psychology is a science, and specifically organizational psychology is a science. And the whole issue is that the findings and applications of psychological assessment research provide empirical evidence. In other words, it's evidence that can be verified. It's not just what someone says, or it's not just someone's ideas. It's been tested using scientific processes at the end of the day. So psychological assessment is the use of tests in order to explain human behavior. And psychometrics is the science of developing tests. You've all completed tests in various forms. You've probably completed like your Facebook online test. What type of person are you? And they ask about colors and about, they look at your profile and stuff like that. But these tests are not scientifically validated. In other words, they haven't used some scientific method to confirm that the results that they get from it are accurate. So the key thing here with the psychological test is that it is standardized. So what means it means to be standardized is that a psychological test is measured against a group of your peers, and we then do various statistics on that test to determine whether the test is a fair measure of whatever construct we are attempting to measure with that test. Okay, guys. Now, there's two broad approaches to psychological assessment: the idiographic approach and the nomothetic approach. The idiographic approach emphasizes the uniqueness of a person. It compares the individual to general test norms, but it's more about the description of the individual. For example, I used to work in a practice in Pretoria, and we used to um, test new clients before they went into therapy. And this would give us a picture of the client and give us a better understanding of the client. It was not so much about comparing the client to the larger population as such, but it was more about giving insight and understanding of the individual. The nomothetic approach, on the other hand, is about norms, and general norms is then we test you and look at how you compare to the larger population. So it's similar to where you look at your marks for a subject and you look where you fell within a class. It's the same principle. We look at your intelligence or your personality or your interests or your abilities, and we measure them against the general population and see whether you are similar in so on the normal, somewhere in the middle, or if you are in the top half or the bottom half of the general population, etc. So it's all about psychological tests and statistics, where the idiographic approach is much more about the individual at the end of the day, and understanding and getting a deeper, richer understanding of the individual. Okay. So, what do we use psychological assessment for in the workplace? For selection. So, before we select someone for the organization, we might do a personality test or an interest inventory or a abilities test or a cognitive abilities inventory. So, we want to know whether the person has got the personality or personality characteristics that would fit with the organization, if they have the necessary capabilities, etc. So it helps us to um, make a selection decision. For developmental purposes, it helps us to, we can assess people and we can see where their general areas of development are. It's quite interesting in terms of promotion, because it also helps us to look at people, especially when we look at personality and interests, etc., and also abilities. And we it helps us to select people for promotional advancement within an organization. And then downsizing. Sometimes it's about selecting the right people to, when we retrench people, it's not necessary. There's a principle called FIFO, first in, first out, which is all good and well, but the principle is often more about whether we should, if we downsize, not to lose our best people, but rather to lose the people that are least advantageous to the organization, and psychometric assessment can help us do that. So what are the domains of psychological assessment? In other words, what are the different areas that psychological tests assess? So cognitive area. Cognitive is your cognitive, your mental processes. So things like thinking, reasoning, problem solving, etc. What we generally speak of as intelligence. Okay, so we the question with intelligence is, how easily does someone understand something, and to what degree can they think logically? So the first guy that came on the picture here was Spearman, and he had his G, or general factor, which is essentially IQ. And how IQ works is 100 times your mental age over your chronological age. Okay, how that works is, guys, your mental age is, we said we standardize the test. Let's say a test has 100 questions. Let's say a child of 8 years old can answer 30 questions. A child of 9 years old can answer 40 questions. A child of 10 years old can answer 50 questions. A child of 11 years old can answer 60 questions, and so on, hypothetically. So we said a child of 9 years old can answer 30 questions on average, but you've got a 9-year-old child, mental age is 9, but they're answering 50 questions, which is an 11-year-old child's ability. So the mental age is 9 over 11 times 100, which would mean that their IQ, I have to work it out, I don't have a board in front of me, which is unfortunate. But 9 divided by 11, how many times would it go in? About 8 times 100. That doesn't make sense. Mental age chronological. Sorry, 11 is, apologies, I've swapped it round. The mental age is 11 over the chronological age, which is 9. So 9 goes into 11, goes in 1 comma 2 times, so it would indicate an IQ of about 120, where 100 is an average IQ. So if you look over here, your distribution of IQ, you get from mentally inadequate to exceptionally gifted, and old Einstein that you've got over there is right off the chart. So we plot people where they fall within it, and average is 100, but most people fall between 85 and 115, which is about 62 or 68% of your population, one standard deviation, and 2 standard deviations fall between 70 and 130. So this helps us to have an idea of a person's mental abilities. If you're a university student, you've probably got an IQ between at least 110 plus, and that means that you have got the ability to perform at university. So you have got no excuse if you are not successful. You've got the cognitive abilities. You can't say to someone, I'm too stupid to do this, because the fact that you got a university exemption, matric, assuming that you didn't buy it, but that you actually passed and got a university exemption, would indicate that you fall above average in terms of IQ. Okay, so there's various guys who've done psychological tests in terms of cognitive abilities, and Thurston, so we had with his G factor, but the problem with the G factor is it's a general intelligence, so you've got an IQ. But we all know that people are good at different things. So Thurston broke it down into 7 prime mental abilities, which is your verbal comprehension, which is your ability to assess, understand verbal, speak language, etc. Word fluency, such as rhyming, naming words and uh, categories, etc., memory, being able to remember amounts of information, numbers, being able to manipulate numbers and the speed at which you can do them. Space is about two-dimensional and three-dimensional reasoning, so being able to um, work with objects in more than one dimension. Perceptual speed is about how quickly you can think, and reasoning is logical decisions. So Thurston broke down that general score into 7 primal mental abilities, as he called them. Now, um, there's various theorists around it, and it's a lot more helpful to have a whole number of mental abilities because we know that people have different strengths. Gardner built on this with his multiple intelligence models. You would have run into Gardner already with the chapter on cognitive processes. But Gardner essentially said there are various multiple intelligences. So people are good, for example, intrapersonal, understand themselves, interpersonal, work with others, bodily kinesthetic, sports person, athlete, firefighter, etc., visual, spatial, sculpture, article. I'm not going to go through each one of them, but the point is we're good at different things. And Gardner argued that each one of those defines a different type of intelligence. Okay, then what's also interesting is that ability is largely dependent on your emotional intelligence in terms of the success of using that cognitive ability. So, what are we talking about here? Emotional intelligence is a concept that was developed by who's the guy who developed emotional intelligence? I can see the book in my mind's eye, and I can't remember the who did it. Goleman developed emotional intelligence, and basically what he said was people with the same IQ. You could have two people with exceptionally high IQs, but the person with the higher levels of emotional intelligence is more likely to be successful. And what is emotional intelligence? Okay, it comprises about four dimensions. So self-awareness, being able to monitor your own emotions, understand what your emotions, what you're going through, etc., and accurately measure your own emotions. And then self-management, be able to manage your emotions. In other words, understand when I'm cross, why I'm cross, what's causing me to be cross, and or what's not just cross. And it doesn't matter what emotion, but understanding the sources of my emotions and be able to regulate them appropriately. And that then goes with social awareness, which is the understanding of other people's emotions. Because if you want to be able to influence other people, you need to be empathetic. You need to be able to understand and read their emotions at the end of the day. So understanding other people's emotions and understanding people's body language, etc. And then the fourth dimension over there is relationship management, being able to develop relations with other people, etc. So that forms emotional intelligence. And why emotional intelligence is so important? If you've got these capacities, you're able to use your cognitive abilities more successfully because you're able to network, bring other people on board, and interact and essentially progress more successfully through an organization. Okay, personality is the second level. Okay, personality is each one of us has a personality. You often hear people saying, oh, someone doesn't have a personality. What they mean is they've got a boring personality. Okay, there's various personality scales. One of them is the 16 personality factor test by Cattell, and if you look over there, it measures 16 different personality characteristics. If you go back to chapter 2, it's 16 different traits that it's measuring. For example, reserved versus outgoing, less intelligent versus more intelligent, submissive, dominant, serious, happy-go-lucky, etc. So it gives us a picture of the person's personality and where they fall on those different scales. And we're particularly interested in the ones, twos, And threes, it's normally a 9-point scale as opposed to 8 that they've got here. But let's assume there's 1, 2, and 3, and 4, 5, and 6 is in the middle, and 7, 8, and 9 is on the other side. We're interested in what's called the outliers, so those that lie outside the norm, not down the middle, because they tend to be more extreme. And let's say, let me use an example. Someone who's completely uncontrolled. If I was selecting policemen, I would not want someone who's completely uncontrolled. It means they were likely to act out on their frustrations, their aggression, etc. But by the same token, if someone is too controlled, they lack spontaneity, etc., and they may not be effective in particular. Okay, a second personality scale is the Myers-Briggs, which is based on Carl Jung's personality scale. Now, the Myers-Briggs consists out of 16 personality types, and it's based on 4 personality dimensions. Introversion, you'll see that all of these 16 types over here are start with either I or an E. It's introversion versus extroversion. Introverted person, quieter, prefers to be alone, gains energy from themselves. Extroverted person, outgoing, louder, etc. The second one is S versus N, sensing versus intuition. So do you use your physical senses, your taste, sight, smell, etc., versus your gut feeling? What do you tend to use more? The third one is feeling versus um, thinking. So, are you more emotionally driven or more cognitively thought driven? And the last one is judgment versus perception. People who are high on J tend to be organized, end tasks easily, where people on P tend to be much more open ended and struggle to finish off tasks, etc. The positive part about the Myers Briggs test is that it's not written in stone. It's quite a helpful test to get an understanding of people's personality, but it gives you your strengths and weaknesses, and it tells you basically, it provides your process profile, and it says to you, these are your strengths, these are your weaknesses, and these are things you need to perhaps look at improving. And it's quite helpful also in relationships and in organizations. I used to use this quite a lot within management development. Now, projective tests. The interesting part about a projective test is that you don't know what's been measured. The Myers-Briggs test has got a high level of face validity, so you know what the questions are being asked. The projective test here, you've got a Rorschach, which is this card up top here. It looks like, it's a Rorschach ink blot test, and it basically asks a question about what do you see over there, and it's tapping into your unconscious. It's one of the most researched tests within psychology, but it's also very interesting. Based on your Rorschach, I can tell you about your aggression levels. I can tell you about your relationship with your mom, the relationship with your father. I can tell you what team you bat for, whole number of things. The thematic apperception test is also a projective technique, and it's also about projecting your unconscious. It's more about projecting what you're feeling at the moment. So, if you look at the little boy here, this is an ambiguous little boy. What is he? You could place a whole number of interpretations on what is happening within this picture. He could be tired, he could be frustrated, he could be anxious, he could be um, just taking a break. He could be contemplating doing something else. He could be wishing he could be out there with his friends. Um, Basically, what happens is you project what is going on in your unconscious onto the picture and give it meaning through that. And we get a better understanding of you through that. Now, the third dimension, or the third area that psychometric instruments measure, is values. Now, I've got Spranger's value orientations over here, and you'll see that Spranger identifies, I think, what do we have, 9 over here, am I right? 3, 6, 7, 8, 9, yeah. And you will notice that some of the things are, or some of the value orientations are on opposite sides. Okay, the reality is, if you're high, for example, on security, like social order, you'll value tradition as well, or possibly power and achievement. But someone who's high on power achievement is not going to be high on benevolence or helpfulness and social justice. So it measures your value orientations, the things that are important to you. Affective behavior, the affectometer that I've got over here, measures particular levels of emotions in relation to a particular stimulus. I've got an example here, different types of movies, and three emotions that the questionnaire measures: fear, sadness, and happiness. Okay. So in a happy movie, you'd expect the guys to measure more happily. In a sad movie, sad. And in a horror movie, you'd expect fear and disgust to raise the highest. And then in a neutral movie, you would expect them pretty much to be equal, or not anyone to stand out in particular. So the effectometer is something that's used quite a bit in market research, etc., to measure people's responses to particular stimuli. And the last one over here is interests, guys. You are, the majority of you, 19, 20 years old, you've enrolled for particular qualifications, you've got some idea of your interests, but you may find when I ask you in class what you're interested in, etc., you have many interests, you're not 100% sure. The interest inventories help us to tie down which areas you tend to be more interested in, and perhaps which area of research or which area of study you'd be better in, or which area you'd be better off working in. And then, oh, sorry, I left out job knowledge and skills. Another form of, it's not so much psychometric tests, it does fall within psychometric testing, but there's various skills measures. For example, it's often practical tests that they will use for particular jobs. So that they'll test your competency in performing a particular skill. So let's say you apply for a job as a welder. They will give you a task where you have to weld something at the end of the day. Okay, so what are the methods of psychological assessment? What they deal with here, CV screening. So in the first stage, it's about looking at the person's CV, and you look at their career and personal information. Often what's more interesting in a CV is not so much what is there, but also what is missing, when there are gaps in the person's experience, when there are gaps in their jobs, qualifications that aren't completed, and things like that. Then the interview is where we ask people questions and delve deeper into that information and get a better understanding. Interviews can be structured. I mean, in fact, in the South African context, if it's for a job, they have to be structured. You have to ask each person exactly the same questions so that the people can, or the candidates can, be compared with one another. Now, assessment centers is a different kettle of fish. An assessment center we use often for management evaluation, management development. Okay, how an assessment center works is there's a whole number of tools that we use. I used to use them years ago in the police when we did middle management development, and one exercise, so we test a person, do psychometric tests, and we give the person feedback. For example, we did the Myers-Briggs, and we give them feedback about their personality strengths and developmental areas. Then there would be in-basket exercises where we would give the person a pile of documents. The scenario would be you in a new post, you've got 4 hours before you have to go off on training, make decisions about these documents, and then we judge people's decisions and how they were made and what processes they went through. And then what's interesting is also group exercises. You will give people particular group exercises where you ask people to um, solve a problem. For example, Lost at Sea is quite a well-known one, where um, you ask the person to um, or the group to select a number of items. Let's say your boat's sinking, you can only take 5 items with you. Give them a list of 30, choose the 5 most important items. It's not about what items they select, it's more about the process that the group follows, and also the process of the individual's participation. So you monitor the person's participation, the type of decisions that they make, type of inputs that they make to the group too. Then there can be presentations, and you monitor social interaction, and there are also often interviews, etc. Okay, and then psychological tests. Guys, all of those tests that we spoke about earlier, the standardized methods, the key thing is standardize against a particular group so we can compare you against a group of your peers and say your personality rates against your peers as follows. Let's say extroversion. The average person is somewhere between extroversion, introversion. So do you fall within the middle, or do you fall on the outliers, so quite a strong extrovert or quite a strong introvert? And it's based on what extroversion versus introversion means within a group of your peers. Okay, guys, I'm going to just take a pause here, and then we'll look at psychological research. Okay, second half, chapter 10 deals with psychological research. In the first lecture, or if you had the first lecture with me, I mentioned that, sorry, apologies, it's now gone and jumped to the slide, but in the first lecture of the year, all scientific knowledge within industrial psychology is generated from scientific research. So what does this mean? Scientific research has a number of purposes: to explore the extent of a problem. So it asks questions, for example, what is the extent of depression within first year university students, or after the disruptions on campus, we could ask the questions of how many first year students are traumatized, etc. Then the second question that you could ask is, how do we describe the phenomenon? What does it mean to be depressed, or what does it mean to be traumatized, etc.? Now, the third question would be to correlate the relationship between some events, say the protests, and students that are traumatized, or students suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. Go to the previous chapter if you want to find out about that again. And then the fourth question is more advanced again, where it asks why certain behaviors occur. So we attempt to do research to identify the causes of particular behaviors. And then finally, it's to predict future behavior, because if I can determine the causes of particular behaviors, I can also then predict how people behave in the future. A good example of this is with recruitment and selection, where we use assessment batteries to look at what does the or what psychological traits or characteristics predict success in a particular job. So you do research in order to validate which of those criteria will predict whether someone will be successful in a job or not. The same applies, for example, with university studies. We ask the questions about which factors will determine which students will be successful or not, because matric results aren't necessarily the most successful predictors of success in higher education. So, research is all about finding out more about a phenomenon, but it's done in a scientifically verifiable manner. Okay, we get two broad approaches to research, which is quantitative and qualitative research. Qualitative research is about going in depth about a phenomenon. So let's say I want to understand how many students are suffering from post-traumatic stress after the protests on campus. So I can go and do a sample of students, and we give out a post-traumatic stress disorder questionnaire, and we see 10% of students are suffering from post-traumatic stress due to being exposed to various events and circumstances, etc. On the other hand,
that's quality. Have I been making sense now? Let me reverse. Qualitative research, I want to understand what it means to be stressed. So, to understand what it means to be stressed, whereas quantitative, I want to understand how many students are stressed. So, quantitative, I use statistics, I can generalize them to a broader population. I take a group of students, I take a sample of those students, I measure a particular characteristic, and I say so many percent of students are suffering from post-traumatic stress. Qualitative is understanding what it means to suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. So I will perhaps interview a few students and find out what does it mean? What are their symptoms in depth? How are they experiencing it? What the consequences have been for it? And it's much more in depth and more personal. But the difference is I can't really generalize it because your experience can be very different to someone else's experience. So qualitative is much more about understanding in depth, getting a richer feeling for a phenomenon, where quantitative is about statistics and tendencies and being able to apply to larger populations at the end of the day. So how do we collect information in research? Okay, first method is observation. So we physically observe people. um, if you observe people in their natural environment, the one question that arises, do we inform them or not? There's a whole lot of ethical issues about whether we inform someone or not. The informing someone beforehand has got strong ethical underpinnings, because the person should have the right to participate or not in research. But the problem is, if we inform someone in a natural setting, it makes it an unnatural setting, because, as you know, when you've been observed, you behave differently. So the idea with observations, where possible, is to observe people in their natural settings as far as possible. The second one is interview. So we sit down with someone. It can be a structured or unstructured interview. We ask particular questions and we get feedback from the respondent at the end of the day. Um, so I just want to check. Okay, we are on track. Apologies. Okay, so in my photo down the bottom there, you've got the one person interviewing someone else, asking questions, getting understanding, etc. So you get quite an in-depth understanding, and the big advantage of interviews is I can ask follow-up questions, so I can check my understanding, etc. Now, experiments. Experiment is where you have an experimental and a control situation. So what you do is you introduce an experimental variable, and we look as whether the experimental variable has some impact on the respondent. Okay, the pictures I've got up here are of quite controversial experiments that were done during the 50s, 60s with the behaviorists. They would not pass ethical scrutiny in the modern world. But basically, what I think it was Bandura did, or was it Skinner? Can't remember which one of them. But you have a baby, and what they did was the child. They would introduce the child to a pet rat or to a pet bunny. But what they did was, every time the child saw this harmless, because it's a pet bunny or rat, someone would knock a hammer in the background, so a loud noise. So what the classical conditioning, the child started to associate the cute little bunny rabbit with the loud noise and became distraught whenever they saw the bunny rabbit. The control situation would be the child with the bunny rabbit without the loud noise in the background. And based on this, the behaviorists proved that classical conditioning does what we claim it does at the end of the day. But as I said, it's very unethical. The children were traumatized. If you read further about this, a lot of these children weren't debriefed and went through their whole life fearing certain objects that they'd been exposed to in experiments, etc., which is very, very unethical. But we do experiments in many situations, because the advantage of experiments is we can determine whether it is that variable that we introduced, or if it is some other variable that is causing the change. Experiments are particularly prominent in the medical industry, where you give a person a new drug and you give someone else a placebo, which is a sugar-coated pill, and basically the control group has a placebo and the experimental group has the drug, but they don't know, the people who are participating don't know who's in the experimental or the control group, and neither do the people administering the pills to them. So then you can see whether it is the pill that is making them better or changing their behavior, or if it is some or other latent variable, in other words, something else happening that is causing the behavior to change. Okay, guys, questionnaires and psychological instruments. We've just looked at in the first half of this chapter the various psychometric instruments. They mostly comprise out of questionnaires, except for your projective instruments, but they ask you certain questions and they ask you to answer the questions. You can get open-ended questions, closed-ended questions. You can get multiple choice questions, for example, like we use in the exam. There's various formats that questions can take. There's Likert scales that I've indicated over here in the example in the slide, from very important to not at all important. So there's all these different formats. The advantage of questionnaires is you can administer a whole lot of them really quickly and fairly cheaply, whereas an interview, the advantage is you can follow up and get more in-depth information, but it takes longer and therefore costs more at the end of the day. Okay, guys, if we look at the research process, what's the first thing you do? You have to select a research topic. So let's do something current. I'm interested now in how students have been affected by the protests on campus and all the things that have occurred around this. So my research topic is, let's say, trauma and protest actions and the actions of the police and security and whatever. So my research problem would be, what impact or to what degree do students exhibit symptoms of trauma who have been exposed or involved in the protests. Okay, the third step is I look at previous research, because it doesn't help that I try and reinvent the wheel. So what I do is I go look at previous research studies that have looked at the same or similar issues and see what they've done, to number one, get an idea of how they did it, and number two, not to do the same thing over and over again. So then the fourth question is formulating objectives or research questions. So let's say my research question is, to what degree have students or do students show symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder who've been exposed to the various actions around the student protests. So my hypothesis is that students will show a higher level of post-traumatic stress disorder than the normal population, or than students at a university that didn't have protests. Okay. The sixth step is I do a sample. Guys, there's 20,000 students at UWC. There's hopelessly too many. Okay, so the first thing I need to do is check which students were exposed. But let's say everyone was exposed to some or other degree, but I can't measure all 20,000 students. So what I might do is take a 5 or 10% sample. There's various sampling techniques that we distinguish between random and or probability and non-probability sampling. The key distinction being, with the probability sample, everyone's got an equal opportunity of being chosen for the sample, whereas non-probability sampling, I select people using some criteria. It may be things such as availability or there's various criteria that I can use. Okay, so I've chosen my sample. I then give out my questionnaire, or I do my interviews, or I conduct an experiment depending on the nature of the research. Then I collect my data, and I correlate my data, and I run my data through a statistical program, often SPSS, and then I make sense of it. So either the student population has a higher occurrence of PTSD than the broader population, or it doesn't. And then there's various statistical techniques that I can use, as you will know from doing Stats 1, that will tell you whether that number is significantly larger or smaller than the rest of the population. And then the final step in the research process is giving feedback or reporting the findings. So I write up my research findings into a research journal and publish an article so that my peers can check my research. If they want to, they can replicate it, so they can redo my research and copy my processes, etc., to check whether my findings can be validated. Okay, key things that we talk about in research is reliability and validity. The reliability is whether a measuring instrument measures consistently. So, for example, test, retest, reliability. If I measure your intelligence does not change significantly over time. So, if I test your intelligence using a test at the beginning of the year and at the end of the year, it should give me, pardon, more or less the same test score for the two administrations of the test. Alternative forms is when I set up two tests that ask basically the same questions but in slightly different ways, and I look at, if you've done the two tests, do you get more or less the same score for the two tests, which you should if they're measuring the same construct. The split half is I take, for example, the odd questions and the even questions, and I split them in two, and then I look at the averages and I correlate them with one another, and I should have more or less the same scores for the two halves of the test. Obviously, it's not as reliable as the whole test because you don't have all the questions, but they should be more or less the same. And then the Kuder-Richardson coefficient alpha. What this test does is it correlates items with one another within the test. So basically, if your test has a number of dimensions, items that measure the same dimensions should correlate highly with one another. So if you answer them positively, you should answer most of the items related to that item positively, and they should correlate negatively with items that measure a different dimension. And this Kuder-Richardson measures the correlation between the different items in the test. Now, your test can be reliable, but validity is whether a test measures what it is supposed to measure, what it claims to measure. And validity is everything. If a test is not reliable, it can't be valid because you can't measure inconsistently and still measure what you're supposed to measure. Because if something measures inconsistently, it's not measuring what it is supposed to measure at the end of the day. So, face validity, I spoke earlier about the Jung Myers-Briggs scale. It's a questionnaire that it's quite easy to see what each question is measuring. So I could see where the question is measuring introversion versus extroversion, sensing versus thinking. The way the questions are phrased is very straightforward. Okay, content validity is the question, does the test cover all the content? For example, if I look at your IPS 132 exam, it has high content validity. In other words, it's based on is it 7 or 8 chapters of your textbook. Each chapter, it covers approximately, let's say, 10 to 12 marks on that chapter. So all the content is covered to a fairly consistent extent. Criterion related validity, there's two types of them. Okay, concurrent and predictive. Concurrent validity is if I use, let's say I develop a short intelligence scale. So I want to quickly measure people's intelligence. I develop a 10 item scale. We've got an existing 100 item scale that takes a long time to administer. But we want to determine whether the 10 mark scale is an indicator of the 100 mark, the score that you get on the 100 mark scale. So what we do is we administer both the 10 mark and the 100 mark scale, and we look at, do students or do respondents score more or less the same. So if the small scale says your IQ is between 80 and 90, and the big scale says you should say then that your IQ is 85 or something like that, more specific. But in other words, does this test or this instrument perform similarly to the criterion against which you are measuring? Predictive validity is whether an instrument can predict some of other behavior in the future. And here, for example, if we are recruiting and selecting people based on psychometric tests, and we are saying that a particular test has got predictive validity, so my test battery should predict success within the job. And if it doesn't predict success, then I'm wasting my time at the end of the day. So I'm using this test to select people, and it should basically do that at the end of the day. Then construct validity is similar to content validity, but guys, much of what we measure in psychology is based on theoretical constructs. So Freud's theory is a number of constructs: his id, ego, superego. Jung uses different constructs. So he's got introversion, extroversion, sensing, thinking, judging, perception, etc. The behaviorists use a different set of constructs. So let's say I'm using a psychoanalytic test and I want to measure your ego strength. Then I would look at the theory. What does the theory say ego strength comprises, and does this test ask questions about all those issues that the theory says ego strength comprises? Okay. Guys, what I spoke about earlier, I spoke about the experiments and ethical issues. It's very important that we behave in an ethical and moral way when we do research and when we practice as industrial and organizational psychologists. Okay, you can be an industrial psychologist, but you're not allowed to do anything that you are not competent to do. So in other words, if you don't have the skills, you haven't been trained in something, you shouldn't be doing it. So if you haven't been trained in a particular test, you should not be administering that test and interpreting it, etc. There's certain moral and legal standards about what is acceptable and not acceptable. For example, relationships between psychologist and patient, or between researcher and respondent, because a person can be in quite a vulnerable place if you're doing research with them, and it can expose them to all sorts of feelings, etc. So there are very strict standards in that regard. You are not supposed to abuse your position. Confidentiality is very important. The respondent's details should remain confidential. It's their private information, and if it could have some impact on them, it should especially stay confidential. Informed consent, the idea that your respondents should have the opportunity to say no, they don't want to participate in the research at the end of the day. Okay, the benefits should be clearly explained to any respondents, but also your research, your benefits should always outweigh any negative consequences, or any what's the term that I'm thinking of, any downsides of the research, etc. Guys, you must always report your research. Going back to moral and legal standards, there should be a professional relationship between you and your respondents. You are acting as a professional person, and the expectation is that you maintain those professional standards, etc. There's quite a bit of issues around computer-based and internet tests, guys. There's issues around competency, around the assumption is often made people are competent in computers, especially young people, and it's not necessarily the case depending on which community and background they come from, etc. So that is also important. And then animal research is highly controversial, and in most cases it is, in modern world, it is no longer accepted. Okay, guys, this is pretty much it. The bottom line is, guys, in preparing for the exam, make sure that you work through the test outline that was covered in Onicanva, and make sure that you can answer all the long questions, guys, and that you have worked through the different chapters, that you've read the chapters, gone through the slides, listened to the lectures, etc. Thanks a lot, ladies and gentlemen. All the best for the exam, and let's hope that things run as smoothly as possible.